Good afternoon. It's Peter Temple, and this is the Thrive in the New Economy webinar. So welcome. Great to have you all here. We've got a pretty good crowd, and whether you're here or not, you're going to get a video at the end of the actual webinar, the live portion. So that should be on your desktop by, I would think, about an hour after we finish up. So I've got a lot of information actually to get through. I put together a lot of content, and my job over the last 3 or 4 days has just been knocking it back. I'm going to start with this first slide here, and then I'm going to introduce myself. I'll actually go live for a few minutes, but those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Most of you, I would imagine, have heard that, and I think it is very apropos for the times that we're in, because a lot of the information I'm going to give you is not very nice today, but hopefully I'm going to get you set up over either partly today and the longer term to be able to weather this storm and do very, very well over the next 10 to 20 years. So what I'm going to do today is introduce you to a world that you might not know. It's your world. It's actually the universe, all those great big balls revolving out there beyond the confines of the earth. That's the universe I'm talking about. And Mother Nature, who pretty well owns everything in terms of what happens on Earth. So she is, for the most part, ignored. But I think that is not going to be the case very much longer, because it's interesting that cycles. I had a Bob Prechter, who used to know an awful lot more about cycles or believe in them a lot more than he does now, who is the Elliott Wave International guy, said to me that cycles are cyclical in terms of people being interested in them. When times are going well, nobody cares. But all of a sudden, when things turn bad, everybody is a little more concerned. So I just want to make sure that you can hear me. And I'm just going to go live here. So if anybody can just let me know that everything, you've got a chat box there. And as long as you can hear me and pretty soon see me, I'm just going to turn that off. There I am. So is anybody around that you can actually let me know in your chat box that you can hear me and see me and everything is looking good? That would be good. No? Anybody out there that can do that? Chat mode, good, Peter. Mike, all right, good, can see me. Thank you. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time so that you understand who I am and where I'm coming from, because I think it's important that you realize that I am a real person. And I am billing myself over the longer term as the truth sage, because I think cycles give you a good idea, if you understand them, of what the truth really is. And my goodness, there's not very much of it out there right now. So I think coming from that particular angle gives you, and I think I need to show you that I'm a real person, gives you an idea of where I'm coming from. I'm just really concerned about the future and that people are going to be safe. And I think an awful lot of people now realize that times are changing and not necessarily for the good. And it's important to understand where they're going, I think, so that you can get prepared for them. So just a little bit about me. Most of my career has been as a writer, producer, director in television. And I did that in the commercial world I did a lot of commercials for about 10 years, for example. And then I went into corporate and got involved with a lot of energy companies, because that's a lot of what we have in this particular province. And during that time, I built a company which was the largest not the largest in the province, but certainly the largest in Calgary. I've built 2 companies from scratch, so I've really been an entrepreneur all my life. And that has been a big part of what I've done. So I understand business. I understand the medical profession to a certain extent because I have Crohn's disease. So I've spent 50 years in that system, and I am I'm pretty well all on natural substances now. I've got away from the ugly pharmaceutical industry, so it gives me a good knowledge of that element as well. And I've spent the last 14 years on cycles. I have read every book on them. For a short period of time, was the executive director for the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. So I'm pretty well an expert on cycles to that degree. And a lot of what I'm going to show you today has to do with cycles. And then I'm going to show you what that means for the future. and give you some ideas as to what you can do to stay safe and to thrive over the next 10 years, let's say. Now, I'm going to share with you a product that I'm setting up at the end of this presentation, and all I'm looking for today is feedback. Would you be interested in that product? Because I don't really have it set up yet, but I'm going to set it up. If there's enough interest, I'm going to set it up over the next few days. And if you're interested, this group will get a really big discount on it. But it's going to be a newsletter and a video once a month, and an area that you can go to converse and, you know, ask questions and those sorts of things. And I think that's really what's needed today going forward, because my goodness, we're all in this together. And you're going to find this is going to be class warfare. It's going to be the 99% against the 1%, and it's going to get really interesting. So with that said, let's get into the presentation. And I'm going to go back to my slides. So most of this is going to be slides, and I am going to try and watch the chat box here. Let me give you a little poll. I set up a poll, and let me see if I can start this. I've never really done this before. But if you see that poll on the right-hand side, and if you can answer the question, that would be great. And I think that would be set up okay, and I'll just let that go. So when you get time, if that works for you, that would be super. Okay, let me get into where we're going today. So my agenda, I've done it. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background. I did my background, but I want to get into how I got into cycles and how I discovered them. And that leads me into a gentleman called Dr. Wheeler, and I'm going to introduce him to you because I think he was an absolute genius and put a lot of this stuff together. Then I want to talk about climate cycles and history. I want to take you back through history, a couple of thousand years, so that you understand how these cycles revolve and how we're really reliving a cycle that has happened over and over and over again in history. And so there are certain traits that cycle top that we're in has. And if you understand those traits, you go, oh yeah, I understand what's going on. This is not good, but I'm going to take you through some of those traits because they are obvious at every cycle top. The stock market gives me an idea of the timing of, we're going into a depression. Now, I don't know how many of you know that. I should have another question that probably asks that. But we are definitely going into one. There is no escaping that reality. And that is something that you're going to get from cycles. So if you know that, then you know how to prepare. And that's the kind of information I want to give you today. Now, I've got a ton of information here, lots of content. I'm going to go through it relatively quickly, and I'm going to try and give you a chance to ask questions at certain points. But realize that I do have a lot of content, and what I've been grappling with is how to get you to understand cycles, because there's about 44, half of you that have never been introduced to them before. And with that knowledge, it sometimes takes going through this a couple of times to really get it. And once you get it, then you can pass this on to, if you believe in it, then you can pass this along to your kids, and this will go through generations. So the next thing I want to talk about is deflation, money, and gold. I'm just going to touch on these and give you an idea of where they're going. Deflation is something that accompanies every depression. It has throughout history. There has not been a depression that has not been a deflationary depression. A lot of people are talking about hyperinflation. Well, that is not going to happen. It's going to be deflation. And if you understand deflation, then that's going to help you plan out your life and where your money should be spent and what you should do over the next 10 to 20 years. And that is one of the most important things that you need to learn. I wanted to talk a little bit about debt and banks, and then finally staying safe and the Thrive Academy, which is this little offer at the end. And I've got some things to give you today in terms of things that you can think about in terms of staying safe. We have about a year before we get into the stock market crash. So there is time to prepare. Even though people think that we're going into a depression now, that's really not the truth. It's going to be in another year, it's going to start. And then we're going to have to be prepared for that. But I'm going to show you how and why that is all going to happen. Now, I want to start by talking about Ralph Nelson Elliott. And I'm just going to show you or tell you how I got involved in cycles and why they become so important to me. When I got out of the television business, because about 15 years ago, the writing was really on the wall. And you're seeing it now in that business is not doing well. It hasn't done well for a good 10 years, even ever since about 2007, where we had the recession, the Great Recession, they called it, which was really the cycle top. 2007 was a 500-year cycle top, or a 1,000-year cycle top, as I'm going to show you. And what happened, the stock market started to turn down, but we got the central bankers involved, and of course, they propped everything up. They made things much worse than they would have been. We would have been through the Depression by now and up the other side if it had not been for the central bankers. And of course, governments getting involved in anything usually make it worse. So thank you very much for the poll. I'm going to get that out of the way here. And I've got another one later on, but we'll get back to my chat box. So Ralph Nelson Elliott was one of the luminaries that came up with the Elliott wave principle, and that's really how the markets move. Very, very important because it's all about cycles. And so he came up with this theory, and this is the theory that I learned. It took me about 6 years to really understand it. And this guy, Robert Prechter, put together this book over here, and it has a number of errors in it. So I had to work through figuring those out. But once you'll find that a lot of people that got into cycles came out of the stock market, because the stock market is very predictable. A lot of people don't know this, but it's extremely predictable. A trend moves in 5 waves, a counter trend in 3 waves, and all the waves have a relationship to each other. And that relationship has to do with the golden mean. The golden mean, 6.618. And if you have heard of that, it's a Fibonacci ratio. And that figures into the markets and figures into just about everything that happens on Earth. So being in the market, there was an article that I ran across one day that talked about the super outbreak of 1974. And that was some tornadoes in the US. And here was 1974 right here. And the tornadoes went through the ceiling. This gives you the number of tornadoes that happened over a period from 1950 at one end over to 2005. And knowing the market like I did at that time, I thought, well, that's interesting, because here was 1974. There was the big recession. They call it a crash here, but it wasn't really a crash. And that was the bottom in 1974. And I thought, interesting that weather would be at the bottom of a recession, because I knew in the 1930s that we had terrible weather. And I knew 1929 was a really cold year. And so I started to get interested, and I went looking. One of the people I found out was Edward Dewey, and he's written a number of books, and he was the guy that founded the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. I think it was about 1931. And he came up with about 3,500 different cycles of different lengths. And I'm going to explain a little bit more of that. But he's got a number of books that are very, very interesting. He went through a number of cycles that affect animals, like fish, and there were a number of them. I have a video on my site that talks very much about this. But that was sort of the basis that I started from. And he's the guy that came up with the 18.5-year real estate cycle. Now, this actually is the chart that he developed. This is where I took it from his point, and I added on these, and you can't see the years here, but we start over here at 1800, and it's every 18.5 years, the real estate prices go up, and then they come right back down, up and down. And so, and over the past 100 years, because of inflation, this has gone up on a on a slope, the entire thing. So now we've got very high real estate prices, and they're all crashing because we have a larger cycle, which is sending them all down. So I just wanted to say that he developed this. There is actually an 18.5-year real estate cycle, and it has to do with the moon. It's the nodal, what do they call it? The lunar nodal effect where the moon is above the equator every 9¼ years and below the equator every 9¼ years. And 18½ years takes the cycle up and down. So this starts us looking at where do all these cycles come from? Well, they come from the universe. They come from the planets. And this is, and it runs all through our life. And you'll find more of that as I go forward, as I explain some of this. The next gentleman I found, and this was part of my move through the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, was this brilliant guy here. He lived from 1892 to 1961, Raymond Wheeler, and he was a PhD in psychology at the University of Kansas. He got really involved in climate, got interested in it because he wanted to know how climate affected individuals. And so what he did was he got some money together and he got 200 people, and they started to study climate going back to the year 600 BC. And here he is, Raymond Wheeler, with something called the Big Book. And the Big Book was a book that he actually recorded all of the events that he could find from 600, and I mean all the events, from 600 BC right up to about 1942, I think was the last entry. And it's about 2,000 pages, very deep. And it took me 2 years to find this thing because it was supposed to be. He gave it to the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, but nobody knew where it was. And it took me 2 years to find it. And I found it at Baruch College in Manhattan in New York. So here it is. And I put a pencil on it just so you could see the size of it. If you open it up, it's 7.5 feet wide. Sorry, I don't know the metrics on that, but 7.5 feet wide. And it is absolutely huge. A couple of people have to carry it out of the library that they keep it in. In that book, you can see all the writing. He's actually written all of this in hand. By hand. He had a number of people working on it. And I think I have another. No, I don't. Each one of these across the top is a different element of society. It might be fashion, it might be politics, it might be social mood, and you can see the green and red. So the green was in cold times, and the red was in warm times, things that he attributed to warm temperatures and cold temperatures, because that's what he was interested in, was the climate. And as you move through this and get more involved in it, you find that certain things happen in cold times and certain things happen in very warm times. And that's what I'm going to get through. Now, he worked for pretty well half his life. I think it was about 25 years on this project with 200 people. And they did most of their research using tree rings, which are very specific in terms of the years that are warm and the years that are cold, and also the rainfall. So he plotted the rainfall and temperature from 600 BC right up until, as I said, 1942. And I have all his charts. I've recorded all of them, and I'm changing them around and bringing them back to life because I'm going to show you one in a couple of seconds. He also tried to write a book, and he never actually got it published, but here are his books. Here's one of his charts that I actually photographed all of these. And here's the chart here that shows you the top of the Roman Empire. And this was, what you can see here is the solid line is the temperature, and this is the rainfall, this dotted line. And he has put on his chart some of the events that happened during that period. Now, I'm taking all those charts and I am changing them around into this. And I'm doing this right from 600 BC all the way up to the latest date. So this is going from 200 BC over to about 400 AD. And you can see what I've done. I've placed Caesar. This is what he wrote in, the Pax Romana and Diocletian. And here's Jesus Christ. I'm going to go through this in a little more detail a little bit later on. But this is the kind of data that he provided. I'm going to show you the top of the English Empire and give you an idea of Queen Elizabeth I and take you through what happens with the temperature. Here's the temperature in red and the rainfall in green, and different things happen based on how warm and hot it is. For example, when it gets cold, you get civil wars. As you're going up through the warm times, you get expansions where you get international wars where countries are overtaking other countries. So where does all this start? Let's think about cycles and what they actually are. So here's an example of a cycle. I mean, cycles are your heartbeat. They can be biorhythms. They can be the sun coming up every day. They can be the tides going in and out. It's really a sine wave. And you can think about it, and what he concentrated on was the warm and wet period. You can think about spring and summer and fall and winter here, and warm and wet in the spring. So you've got wet in spring and fall, and you've got hot in the summer and cold in the winter. And both the winter and the summer are dry. All right, that's pretty straightforward. When you have cold, you're more energetic. You would know that. When you are dry, there's a tremendous amount of famine that usually happens during dry times. And when it's wet weather and you have lots of things growing, that's a very good time. And when you have hot weather, you're very lethargic. So not that much gets done in the summer. That's why we take holidays. In the fall, you get cool and wet, and we get energized. And in the winter, we have lots of energy, and the people are out skiing and doing all kinds of things. But it's very dry. And then we move through spring, and it becomes warm and wet, and the whole cycle starts again. So that's on that basis. Now, you know those are every 3 months during a year. But what if there were larger cycles that were 25 years in length and 100 years in length? And those were, for example, dryness that went over 100 years that was sort of overarching this weather on a yearly basis. Well, there are. And he figured that out. So that when you have a spell that's got a larger cycle, like these cycles here, these sine waves, you can think of it this way. This is a larger cycle, might be 500 years, down to something that might be 3 months. These larger cycles trump or send down, or what's another word, overbear, I guess. They're overbearing on top of the other cycles. So if you get an 18.5-year cycle going up and down, and you get a 500-year cycle heading down, it's going to send these cycles down with it, and the same thing going up. So if I put some numbers to these cycles, what Dr. Wheeler came up with 25 years for a cycle, and we're in about a 25-year cusp right now, because the top of the warm period was actually 1998, and we've been going pretty well sideways in terms of temperature ever since then, and I expect us to start to turn much colder fairly soon. So there's a 25-year cycle. He found a 100-year cycle, 170 years, 515, and 130 years. And those were the cycles that he found through all of his work in what he called the Big Book. So let's go look at how that would affect the overall. So this is not one of his charts, but here's a chart looking at minus 9,000. So that would be 9,000 BC to the glacial period, and how we came out of that when it was very cold, and how we started getting these cycles. And you can see that at the tops of these cycles, when it's warm and wet, we get a large civilization forming. So we had ancient Egypt that actually ended up being 3 empires. Then we got the third one really isn't on here. It was a much smaller one. And then we got ancient Egypt, the one, the new kingdom that we know mostly. Then we got into ancient Greece and Rome. And you can see how this goes warm and wet, cold and dry. Warm and wet, cold and dry. We had the Greek Dark Ages down here. And then we had Greek rose again, and the Roman Empire overtook it. And then we went into another Dark Ages where it got really cold and dry, then warm and wet and cold and dry. This is the little ice age called the Maunder Minimum. And then here we are today, the modern warm period, and we have a new empire. And I'm going to show you these in more detail here. Another empire, which is the American Empire. And then now we're going to go cold and dry again. So this is the predicted, Dr. Wheeler predicted the end of this warmth at the year 2000. Not bad, eh? So that's how he did that with he's got something called the drought clock, which I'm going to show you. And so that's what I'm expecting to have happen. Now, you might say this is one guy who's come up with this theory. And I just wanted to show you this is the sine wave is down here. And that's true. There's a gentleman called Steve Puetz that some of you who are traders might know of. Steve's in Hawaii. And in the 1990s, he put together this book called the Unified Cycle Theory. He also comes out of the Elliott wave theory and was a trader. He's a scientist now. And so the thing that he did was spent, I don't know how many years Steve did this. I interviewed him once through Skype. He spent years going through all of these cycles, and he found out that Wheeler's were the best cycles. And he went through all of the probabilities of whether these cycles were real. And he found out that they vary only about 1%. And so you've got the major cycles. A minor one is 25 years, but the major cycles are 6.3 years. That you would know from the Bible, 7 years of feast and famine. Then he found out there was an 18.5-year real estate cycle. And these are harmonics. So you can take the 6.3 years and multiply it by 3, and you get roughly 18.5. 3 times 18.5 takes you to 54 to 57 years, which was the Kondratiev cycle, or Kondratiev cycle, who's a Russian that discovered that. 3 times 57 takes you to 172. So we found out that Wheeler's cycle was off by about 2 years, and the 172-year cycle is a key cycle. 3 times 172 takes you to 516 actually, but sometimes they just call it 515, and twice that takes you to 1030. And those are your major cycles. So what does that mean? Well, it means that Steve found out that these things are periodic, so that they happen pretty well right on schedule. Sometimes you can have a 172-year schedule that's late by about 20 years, and you call that, well, it just added on a little 18.5-year cycle. But typically, they will turn at one of these cycle tops, and I'm going to show you that. Dr. Wheeler put together something he calls the drought clock, and I've just updated this. And in here, you can see all the years from 450 AD all the way around to 2000. And these lines here in this sort of yellowish or more orange, I guess, are 100 years. So this is every 100 years here, a major cycle. And then this is 170 years. And you can see that the dark areas on here, which are largest, hit these 100-year cycles. Those are droughts. And the 172-year cycle, which is this one, he called it 170 years, hit the major droughts, much larger. So you can see there's one here, there's a couple that combine. And so when you get droughts, you get famine, you get cold and dry. So this is a clock he put together. This talks to the periodicity of it, that these things happen pretty well right on schedule. And so this is the historic droughts that you get, and you can pretty well plot these. So that was an important piece of information. And by that, he thought that we were going to have the end of this 1,000-year cycle at the year 2000. And sure enough, here's the weather chart that I've got, climate weather. This is temperature. This was the spike at 1998. And this is the sort of up and down. If you know anything about the stock market, you might call this a first wave down, and this being a second wave in Elliott wave. And it's interesting that when we came down here in 1999, 2000, we kind of went sideways for a while. We had a very cold year in 2007, 2008. That's what that is right there, which is where we had the recession. So its stock market came down, and then it went back up again, and now we're starting to head down. So you will find that when we get a major change in climate and it gets cold and dry, the stock market always crashes. In 1974, we had the same thing happen. Everybody was talking about the ice age coming, and they thought that we were going to go into another Maunder minimum there. And of course, we had a great big recession, and the stock market crashed. I don't call it crash, but it did come down. And so these things start to seem to happen in tandem. So let's go look at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is looking at temperature over a very long period of time. Now, I have all of Wheeler's information and his data, and they're very specific. This is something called the Greenland Ice Core's data. Iceland, the GISP, it's the Greenland Ice Sheet Project. 3 countries got together in the 1980s, 1990s, and they decided to pull a bunch of ice cores out of Greenland. And ice cores give you, just like tree rings, give you very specific information on climate going back many, many years. I always get attacked on this. People try and, you get the climate, people that don't believe that climate just happens naturally from the sun are always attacking me on this. And I say, well, this is just secondary information. The interesting thing about this is it's exactly the same data as Wheeler got. Exactly the same. So you got 12, this is 0 here means that this is pretty well the year 0. So this was the time of the Roman Empire, and it was at a high. And then we went down into a dark ages to the bottom here. And then this was about roughly the year 1000, the year 2000, where we're at. I'm going to show you this in a little bit more detail. And this one was about 1200 minus 1200, or that would be BC. But you can see that these tops are roughly about 1,000 years apart. So when I'm talking about a 500-year cycle, I'm really talking from roughly the bottom to the top. They're really top to top. They're about 1,000 years. 1,030 is the actual number that we deal with. And this one was a little long. This one had an extra little 172-year cycle, about 200 years. So these are rough numbers. If I then move forward and show you how the same points here, these show you the 1,000 years. All of these points here are 172 years. And you can see that for each of them, we tend to have spikes. So each 172 years, the climate goes back up again. Again, it looks like a lot like the stock market, what I'm used to seeing. So 172 years, another 172 years. This one didn't have a major one, but a lot of the time they do, they spike up. And on these particular little spikes, you tend to get another small little civilization. And I'm going to show you that next. So we take this and we fill it in with the civilizations, and you will find that when it gets warm, we had Egypt. So we get warm and wet, lots of food. You get a civilization that starts up, and then it gets cold and dry, and it falls apart again. It destructs. And then it goes back up again. And we tend in these areas to get these very cold periods that we call, what do we call them? I'm just losing my, where's my dark ages? So I'm going to take you through some of these in a little more detail. Let's go to this next slide here. So you can see that, now let's go back. Ancient Egypt is here. Classical Greece started up here. Now it had a little period earlier on where it started up, and then it had some dark ages where it kind of fell apart, and then it rose again. And then Rome overtook Greece, and here's the top of the Roman Empire. And then of course Rome fell apart. There've been lots of books as to why that happened, but most of it was climate and what happened financially to them. And you'll find that when all of these civilizations and empires get to the top, they tend to get so large and so corrupt that they start to fall apart from the inside. There's just so much rot that they start to implode, and it gets colder and drier, and they have famine. So everything happens at the same time to pretty well pull them apart. And they really just self-destruct. And then another 1,000 years later, sometimes in between, you get these other little civilizations, like here's the Mayan Peak. Everybody wonders, well, why did it self-destruct? Well, it got cold and dry again. Here's the Viking Age. This is the medieval warm period that was about the same warmth as it is today. And these ones were warmer. So that gives you an idea of the temperature. So this is just temperature, and it parallels the work that Wheeler did, except Wheeler was much more specific, and I've got a lot more data. I can give you data right down to the day on Wheeler's work, and I can't do that here. This was the modern warm period, which of course is the American Empire, and this is where we sit now. So let's fill this in a little bit more. So here's the really interesting stuff when you get into this in a little bit more detail. The ancient kingdom of Egypt. Here's Sparta right at the top of this spike here. We had the Greek Dark Ages, which this is called. Then we had classical Greece. And as we go up and get warmer and wetter, and everybody is feeling good and eating well, and we are creating larger populations, we have all these international wars. So Wheeler found out that as we expand, countries overtake other countries like Rome did, and it became huge till we got up to Julius Caesar and a little bit after that. And then it started back down again. And this is, we've got two JCs here. Jesus Christ. You will find that you get rulers that get assassinated very at the top of these things as it starts to get colder. And you will find that you get new religions that start as it gets colder. And then you get civil wars on the downside. So here again, another spike. This is Muhammad, who, of course, was a new religion in about 600, and it happened on the downside. So I'm going to give you an idea as to the traits that happen when you go through these cycles, but this is an expansionary cycle. This is one where you get civil wars, and you get these civilizations that self-destruct, and this goes on and on. So another dark ages here, Vikings, the medieval warm period, the Norman conquest was in here, 1066. And then you get these little spikes up 172 years, and you had the Spanish and British empires. And then it got cold and wet again. And this was the Maunder minimum down here at about 1664, a little bit after that. And you got the 13 colonies, the US, and then that has become the newest empire. And now that is, if anybody noticed, is starting to self-destruct. You're getting all the corruption coming to the top. And one of the cool things about the tops of these cycles, this 1,000-year cycles, is the truth starts to come up, starts to come out, because what happens with social mood, it gets negative. And as we have a negative social mood, and this happens all over the world, you're starting to see the riots. You're starting to see them in France. You're starting to see them in Hong Kong. And you're going to see them an awful lot more. You're going to get more riots and things happening. People just aren't going to take it anymore. And that's what happens. Some of these, the pedophilia comes out into the open. And you're seeing that's happened over the last little while. So there's certain traits that you get on the upside. So we're done with the international wars. You don't have to worry about that, but you do have to worry about civil wars. And I know that the US is going to go into a civil war. You can start to see that happen, but cycles tell you that that's exactly where we're going. And that's one of the important things that you get out of cycles. So I just want to talk a little bit about the traits on these cycle tops. And how am I doing for time? Not too bad. So cycle tops, here's some of the traits you get at these tops of civilizations. And you'll recognize a lot of these civil wars, riots, and revolutions. Well, that's as we start down. And you know we have the 99% and the 1%. During these, let me go back to this period here. Oh, it's not the one I want. Back to this period here. During these expansion phases, and this has happened at almost every one of these, we go through an inflationary stage where governments inflate your currency, and then you get a depression on the downside and you get deflation, which all of a sudden makes the currency more valuable. So you're going to see that these traits go up and down with the cycles. So let me get back to my list here and I'll take you through that. So we turn cold and dry at the top of the 1,000-year cycle. We get a lot of migration, and you're going to find that there's going to be an awful lot more, particularly I'm thinking in the US that has very large cities, from urban to rural. Because you'll find that when we have famine, and we've got a lot of trucking companies that have gone out of business. So what I'm concerned about is the transportation system, is that food doesn't get into big cities. And that is going to be a problem in a couple to 3 years, where you're going to get people that are going hungry. And if you get them in a big city with a lot of them together, it's going to be very tough for them to find food. And if you look at the younger generation today, they've never had it tough. And so it's going to be difficult for them. A lot of them don't cook. They just go to restaurants and things. And when you see where the stock market is going, you can realize that they're not going to be around. And it's going to be a lot tougher on the younger class. I'm really quite worried about them. We get class struggles. This is going back to the French Revolution. Let them eat cake. Napoleon followed that. He came out of that in the early 1800s. But there was a revolution. Again, the 1% and the 99%. That's typically what happens. You know that's a big deal today. Pandemics. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on. Pandemics crop up in the dark ages as it gets colder and drier. So this one we just had which is a little bit out of place, but I'm going to leave that later. But we're going to have a lot more of them as it gets colder and drier. Famine. You will notice that, and this happens at the top of all of these cycles, we get 3 or 4 years of floods. And we've had them over the last 3 or 4 years, and it's pretty well ruined a lot of the crops in central U.S., in the West, central Midwest, and that is a problem. Everybody's talking, well, not that many people are talking about it in the mainstream media, but it certainly is a concern that we're going to have a lot less food for the same population. We always have a low birth rate at the tops of these cycles. And that's because, and this is interesting, I just read a book on this, low testosterone accompanies these major cycles. So you get a lot of governments trying to tell people to have babies because they're worried that the population is decreasing, and that of course affects the financial situation, but there's nothing you can do about it. Testosterone is very low right now, and that happened in the 1920s as well, going into 1930 and the big depression that we had then. Now, testosterone, men and women have testosterone, is the, let's call it the drug, it's the hormone that allows us to think critically. So if we don't have it, we're less able to think critically. And so one of the things we're getting, if you're thinking that people aren't making an awful lot of sense these days, and that's one of the things I'm getting. It's really because the testosterone is very low. And when you get low testosterone, what takes over? Cortisol. So it becomes the main hormone, and cortisol is the fight or flight hormone. So this is where, when you get these turn downs in the stock market or the turn down in the 1,000-year cycle, you all of a sudden get all this fear. And this is when you get this pandemic, it really was a little flu bug. You will find that people are very, very fearful, and it's just irrational fear. But that is their hormones speaking, and that is something that accompanies these tops. You get a lot of corruption and palace intrigue. There are a lot of, for example, at the top of Rome, a lot of assassinations. After Caesar, there was assassination. Every second ruler got assassinated or murdered. It's a women's world, and this has something to do with the testosterone. Testosterone being low, certainly in men, but women are dominant at the tops of these cycles. At the bottom, when it's colder and drier, men are more dominant. Authoritarianism, you've noticed that. Propaganda, there's a ton of it at these top cycles. And restricted free speech. We get that a lot, but the truth tends to come out. So I know that I have been warned on Facebook when I started to put up my COVID-19, blog post that I did, and it didn't have a video, but it had a blog post, and they warned me that they thought that it wasn't something that they would promote. I wanted to actually promote it to a larger audience, and they said that they wouldn't do that. And then I went back at them and said, well, there's nothing in this, and they allowed it. But they're taking an awful lot of videos off the internet that are not the government line. And so that is a restriction of free speech, which I'm really concerned about. Weak leaders, we get weak leaders at the top of these 1,000-year cycles, and we also get, of course, a depression and deflation. Weak leaders, anybody come to mind? I think we can see that all over the world. So that's the kind of thing that happens. So just a quick talk about pandemics. Here's looking at that same chart, and you get these dark ages, and that's when you get these plagues, leprosy, way back here in BC, and then you get all of these other ones. So we had this little pandemic over the last few months. We are going to get more. There's no question. And these are going to be things like the Black Death. Ebola worries me. And so this is one of the things that longer term, once it gets colder and drier, that you have to prepare for. So let me just very quickly go through the Roman Empire. So this is the top. I'll just show you a couple of things here, which really gets into these traits, where we had a very warm period at the top of the Roman Empire, and we had Julius Caesar, who of course got murdered by his senators. And then they went into a civil war right after that, because Julius Caesar declared himself, come on, Peter, you can do better than that, declared himself a dictator, and his other senators were quite jealous of that, and they ended up murdering him. And then we had a civil war in here, and then we got back into other leaders. And as I said, every second one was assassinated. There were about 12 leaders over 100 years. And then it got really cold. We had Jesus Christ that cropped up in this area here from 4 BC to 30 AD, and it was cold and dry, or getting cold and dry. The same thing with Muhammad and the Islamic religion happened just after a top. So then we had this Pax Romana, which was interesting because they call that a very peaceful time in Rome that lasted through to we had Diocletian. But as I say, it was peaceful for the people living there, but they were assassinating the leaders left and right. Then we had a plague as it got cold and dry here, and civil wars that took over until we got back up to a warm period, and we had Diocletian 284 to 305, who reconstructed Rome, and this was the largest empire that they had had at that time, and he put in a whole bureaucracy that lasted at least until his death. And then it got colder and drier, and they started migrations, and the invasions started, and Rome started falling apart over the next 300 years. One of the problems that they had, of course, they had this very large army, which now, I don't want you to think about the US or anything, but large army that they had to have because they had to keep everybody in line because Rome was a huge empire. And they started paying their soldiers, and that pretty well bankrupted them. The other thing they did was inflated their coins, and that also helped to bankrupt them because their money became almost worthless at the end. So that is one period that I wanted to show you at the top. Here's another one. This is the top of absolute monarchy in the 1500s in England. And you can see this is a major cycle turn, 1492, and another one, 1664. So this would be a 172 year cycle here. And you can see that it got warmer all the way up. In fact, this pattern here is very similar to the pattern that we've had over the last 100 years, whereas we had a little dip here in 1974, and this was actually when Henry VIII was alive. And Henry VIII was a tyrant around 1500, and they were lopping off people's heads left and right during this time. And this got into the rise of modern nationalism. When he left, then we got into Edward the Sixth, there were some weak kings in here, and then we got into Bloody Mary. And at the top, we get more tyrants at the top of these cycles, and Bloody Mary ended up killing about 300 heretics, and she burned them at the stake. So there's one of the rulers that nobody really liked at the end of this, but she got her head lopped off in the end. And then we got into Elizabeth I, and she lasted from 1558 to 1603. But at the same time that went on, I talk about palace intrigue. There was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was the Queen of Scotland, and she ran into some trouble and actually escaped Scotland for England. And she was next in line because she was related to Elizabeth if Elizabeth didn't have any children. Well, Elizabeth, of course, didn't have any children. So she sat in the background here for years as Elizabeth ruled. And there were all kinds of plots going on to remove Elizabeth based on her. And this went on until Elizabeth finally had her put to death. So if you think about what's going on in the U.S. at the top of this cycle, we have had Donald Trump. They've tried to impeach him several times. We've had Russiagate. We've got Ukrainegate. We've got what's going on with General Flynn. We've got things that are falling apart. That's the palace intrigue that I'm talking about, and it happens always at the top of these cycles. So that you can see, anytime that I'm looking for something or see something happen like climate, I'm looking for, okay, where's the corruption? Follow the money. That's the kind of time that we're in right now. And once everything starts to get colder and drier, we eventually get into more democracy, and we have a new monetary system, and all of this stuff gets washed out, all of the rot. So there was the Elizabeth I. Here's St. James I with his Bible. And then we got colder and drier. As you can see how it turned colder here. And what do we have? We had a little depression in here in the 1580s and 90s. And then we had a major depression, and the bubonic plague and the fire of London happened in here. And then we had this Maunder minimum, very cold weather. We got down to 1645 to 1715. And that you would get the Seine River in England would freeze over during the winter. That's how cold it was. Civil strife, famine all through this area. This is what they call another Dark Ages. Okay, so, and during this period, 1157 to 1647, that should be 1657, or sorry, 1557 to 1647, Spain went bankrupt about 6 times. So you get problems with finances, governments overspend. The same thing is happening in the US. It's happening all over the world. The world is essentially bankrupt. And Shakespeare was up in here. So with Rome, of course, we had the Colosseum, and when things got tough, they used to send people to the Colosseum for these great shows with the gladiators and animals, and that's how they would keep them happy. And in Queen Elizabeth's time, of course, they had Shakespeare and all the plays, and so that was how they kept people happy in those days. So you see the same themes happen over and over and over again. Oliver Cromwell was 1653 to 1658, so he was in this period here, and that really devolved into no government at one period, and then it started getting better. So we got into the Bill of Rights, so more democracy towards the cold times and more authoritarianism towards the warm times. So it gets better, but we're going to go through some pretty tough times before we get there. Here's looking at Henry VIII. Donald VIII. I call Donald Trump the reincarnation of Henry VIII because there's an awful lot of things going on in common with these two. And the interesting thing is that Henry had 6 wives. Of course, Trump had 3, both egotistical and insecure. They both like younger women. Henry VIII battled the Pope and for superiority, and he got excommunicated by the Pope. And of course, Trump is going after the deep state. They both love silly hats. We know Trump's big red hat. But neither one of them, Henry was not expected to become king. It was just one of those things that happened. He wasn't really next in line, but there was a death and he ended up being king. Trump wasn't really expected to become president. Both over 6 feet tall and both charismatic. I spelled that wrong. And so there you can see the similarities. So I just want to make one more point before I go looking for any questions you might have, is that this all relates back to the universe, because Wheeler was interested in climate, and he thought that climate affected how people felt and what they did. But in fact, the climate only changes by a few degrees. What we know now is that it's electromagnetic waves. Geomagnetic storms, for example, have a lot of influence on us. There was a gentleman called Alexander Shazevsky in the late 1800s and early 1900s that figured out the mass excitability index. Now, this came from the 11.3-year solar cycle. And I'm going to show you that in just a minute. But he figured this out in terms of solar cycles, and he got 8 years in the gulag from Stalin. You find that a lot of these people that were cutting edge and started to talk about, the universe and the effects that it had on humans ended up in the gulag, certainly when they were in Russia. So he's talking about the sun and solar flares and sunspots. Now, every 11.3 years, we have sunspots, which rise into a culmination. So this is the sunspot history from 2001. And just like the moon, when you have a full moon, you can talk to anybody that works in a hospital. They'll tell you everybody goes nuts, or the police. People just go absolutely crazy. And the moon affects them, and that's electromagnetic waves from the moon. And you get that from the sun as well, but the sun is every 11.3 years. So I plotted some of the things that happened here in 2001, where we had the sunspot highs. 9/11 was at this spike right here, where we had the buildings, of course, that collapsed and the planes that went into them. We had a market top at this spike right here in the stock market. We had the Alaska Airlines 88. There were some airlines that crashed right at the top. So you tend to get buses going off cliffs. You get airplanes crashing. If you look later, 11.3 years later, we had Sandy Hook at the top of this spike, Kenya murders, 6 Bush crashes right in here. Syrian conflict started up. Flight 370, I think that was the one that went to Australia, I think, and just disappeared. Boston Marathon. So all of these things cause people to react. And we get the Korean ferry that went under and killed all kinds of people. And so you have to be cognizant of the fact that we are influenced by electromagnetic waves from the planets. Primarily the sun, but the planets all affect this. And so this is why you get these going over a longer period of time from 1600 to 2100. You can see the highs here of the sunspot activity. And we had the Maunder minimum here where there was none. We're now going back into a period where we're going to have none, and it's going to get colder and drier. So that's what scientists will tell you. And that's the climate scam that we just had. And of course, I had a viral video go out on that. And so that was one of the things that I was very close to. And I knew because of my work in cycles that it was a scam. All you had to do was follow the money. So I will now just let you ask any questions that you want. I'm sure you have a lot. I've given you as much as I sort of can. I'm just going to get my camera here, if I can do that. We've got the... There we go. So, I've turned orange. Any questions? I'll just kind of look back here. If there's anything that, no buffer, I'm back. Sorry. Oh, anybody got any questions about what I have just delivered here in terms of cycles? I'm willing to ask anything in a period of about 5 minutes. And then I'm going to quickly get back into some of the things that are the result of some of these cycles. No, not seeing any questions. There's about a 20-second delay here. So I understand that. And I do have another little poll here. So I just reset poll. And it's just, maybe that was one of the problems, that the chat box is not going. Do you think the market topped today in a decline? Well, I shouldn't really tell you that, but I would say look for a top sometime this week. Okay, that gets into my proprietary information. So I'd say that we're very, very close on that. Why are you concerned about Ebola? Only because it's sort of simmering there in the background. And when you get into a colder, drier period, you get these pandemics that spread. They spread in colder and drier times. And that is because we have famine. People aren't eating properly during these cold and dry times. There's also a negative mood, and that also, and there's a lot of suicides. So you just get people that are feeling not very well and not eating properly, and it is a time that is ripe for these things to spread. You know that we get the flu every winter. Well, it's colder and drier, and that's when these things spread. So that's the problem. That's why I'm concerned about it. Why deflation and not inflation? That gets to into a discussion, and one of the things that I'm going to do is cover that off in some videos. If you want to get involved in this subscription later on, which is going to be a newsletter and a video every month, one of the things I'm going to do is explain that in some depth, but I'll do it. I'm going to get into that a little bit later on. But basically, when you have, let's talk about the US dollar. The US dollar is the reserve currency. It's all over the world. When people start to hoard the dollar, when there isn't that much of it around, it goes up in value, and you call that deflationary. When credit starts to falter, and if you understand, this is why it gets so complicated. Banks create money. That's how money is created and put into the economy. So when people are asking for loans, banks press a magic button and create digital money, and that goes out as a loan. If that's not happening, money is not going into the economy. Once it comes back, or we get mortgages that default, the money actually disappears. It digitally disappears, so there's less of it around. So to have inflation or hyperinflation, you have to have lots and lots of money in the economy. If you have the opposite, you go into deflation. We're going into a situation now where we're going to have not very much money because we're going to have a lot of people going underwater in their mortgages because if you think about what's happening with the stock market is going to crash, and that's going to take down a lot of businesses. Those businesses will go bankrupt. Those loans will go bad. Houses and mortgages will go bad. That money then contracts and goes away and is not in the economy anymore, and that creates a deflationary situation. But your money goes up, the money that you have goes up in value, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Are we headed for a Maunder minimum? Yes, but not for a while, probably not in our lifetime. And I'll talk, when you talk about the Maunder minimum, let's just go back and I'll look at that slide here very, very quickly because I want to move on. Let's go back here. I'll just share my screen. If we go back to this Maunder minimum here, this was the Maunder minimum here. This was the top of, this was the top of the cycle. This was the Maunder minimum way down here. So it took about 700 years for this thing to actually hit a low. It differs each time, but usually it gets very low towards the end of the cycle, and then it shoots back up again and gets warm. So I would say if it does the same thing, it's going to gradually get colder, and about 500 to 700 years, we're going to hit a low, and then it's going to pop back up again. And that's my way of trying to answer that question for you. I'm going to keep these and move on because I've got a lot of information to get through, and then I will come back to other questions because we've gone in an hour already, and I want to handle some very quick things, and it's on this subject. So let's go look at the stock market. This lady here, who was the chief of the Federal Reserve before Powell, used to say that there was no bubble. And this wasn't that long ago. I mean, when was she? Powell's only been, I think, around for a couple of years. So Janet Yellen said there absolutely is no bubble. Well, let's look at the stock market. This is a, what have I got here? A quarterly chart of the stock market. So this goes actually back to 1929. And you can see from there, actually, this was 1974. Right at the bottom here, you can see how this thing has gone up. And now we're from, what were we at? $570. This is the Dow. $570 in 1974. We're at about 30,000 now. Is that not a bubble? So it's gone up 5,200%. That's inflation. And I would call that almost hyperinflation. So that's one of the things that happens when you have too much money in the economy. So this is an arithmetic chart. If I go and look at this in a log scale, this kind of spreads it out so that you can actually see the waves. So this is 1929 here. Here's the same thing. This is where Nixon was. So when Nixon actually decided he was going to de-link the US dollar from gold, all of a sudden the market took off, and he was around from 1969 to 1974. And of course, he was impeached. When it gets cold and dry and you get a recession, bad things happen to people in power. Okay. And that's another thing that you're going to find at the tops of these. So that's the same information there, but you can see how this thing has gone up. Now, the market, for all of those of you that do not know how markets work, and this is from Elliott wave, here's 1929. The market went down 90% in 1929 to 1930. And then we went up in 5 waves. 5 waves is how the market actually moves. Our top was in 2007. This was the 172-year cycle top, exactly. And the market came down, and we had our recession. But the central bankers started to put a whole bunch of debt into the market, and they've sent this back up in a very unnatural wave. So they've sent it up from about 6,000 points all the way up to 30,000. And so we could have been through a depression by now, but they've made it that much worse. It's still going to come down. It's going to come down in 3 waves, and it is going to come back pretty close to where it was in 1974. the market always reverts to the previous fourth wave of one lesser degree. I know that's gobbledygook to a lot of you, but that's what always happens, and it's what we're seeing happen now. So we're going to get down to about $900 here, or certainly under, I tell people, certainly under 300. It goes back to the area of the previous fourth. So certainly under 3,000, which is a big drop from 30,000. So if you're a speculator in the stock market, that's an opportunity for you as the market comes down. In 1929, an awful lot of people made money from shorting the market, and that's the kind of drop that we're going to get, and that's the enormity of it. So I just wanted, this is really bad news, but we're going to see that over a period of about 5 years. And we should see the top next year. So there's still a year. Going to my next chart. This is just a little 3-day chart. This is where we are now in the S&P 500. So you can see over a 3-day chart how we've ended up finishing what would be a third wave. And this is a fourth wave down here. I'm expecting a turn to the downside. And then we have one more wave. As I said, trends always go in 5 waves. So we've had our third. This is our fourth. And we're going to get that over the next month or two, a big drop again. And then we've got one more wave going up to a new high. I think our top is going to be 2021. So why do I say that? We got about a year to get ready, and maybe a couple of years before this thing starts to come down big time. And so if you're going to stick around and get prepared, you don't really have to worry about what's happening right now. We're going to have a recovery, but it's not going to last. Okay, so I wanted to just give you that information. So I don't see any questions. So let's go on with this, and then you can ask any questions as we go a little bit further. This is what I'm expecting. This is the 1929 crash. The waves should come down in 3 waves like this, and it usually does during these crashes. So we would be just about in here, and then we're expecting one more wave up to a new high. This would be the third wave, the fourth wave, and a final 5th wave. And then we come down in 3 waves. And it should come down about 90% of going all the way back to 1974. Deflation and gold. So that's where the market is going. So that's not good news. But how do you stay safe? Well, deflation and gold, this talks a little bit about deflation. I talk sometimes about the frog effect, that, you've been inflated to death. Ever since the last 100 years, they've been inflating our money supply, so that in about, early 1900s, 1913 in the US, before they had the Federal Reserve, the dollar would have been worth $1. Well, today it's worth about 4 cents as compared to what it was 100 years ago, because they've inflated it away. When you inflate the dollar or the money and create more of it, or there's other ways of doing it. In Rome, they used to take the silver out of the coins until over a couple of 100 years, there was no silver left in the coins, so they were worthless. And that's another way of doing it. Today, we have digital money, and Nixon delinked that from gold, so it's virtually worth anything that you want it to be worth. But through inflation, through interest rates, they have devalued this dollar so much, and through flooding the market with all of this debt, they have devalued our dollar. You don't notice it as much, because the frog effect is like the old story is, you can put frogs in a pan of water and bring it to a very slow boil, and they won't get out because they don't notice that the water is getting warmer, and eventually they just boil to death. But that's an old wives' tale. It doesn't actually happen. But it's very similar to what happens with people, what we're going through now. I mean, we've got 4-cent dollar. This has happened over the last 100 years, and it's got to the point where your money is not worth anything. That's why everybody's broke. Prices are going up, and yet your money is not worth anything. And that's one of the things that you have to realize. So here's going back to 1913, where you would have had a full dollar. And this is showing you the results. We actually had deflation when this is 1913. This is 1920 and into 29. We had deflation, where the money actually became more valuable. And then, deflation went up here. This is the deflation line. This is inflation, where it becomes less valuable. Deflation. So up through the 1930s, it became more valuable. And then we started to deflate again. And now our dollar here is worth about 4 cents, 96% drop in its value. So this is what the government has done. They steal from you by doing inflation. They make your money worthless virtually. And that's not a good thing. So your lifestyle gets tougher and tougher and tougher. If you know the 1950s and 60s, my mother didn't have to work. Well, now both people in a family typically work, and you don't make as much, and things are pricier. We have the highest household debt in history in Canada, and between Australia and Canada, the debt is the highest in the world, household debt. That's a problem. And so there's going to be an awful lot of people that are going to find bankruptcy. So that's one of the issues that we have, and governments have done that to you. So we need to learn about deflation. I'm going to move here. This shows you inflation during Roman times. This is the 240, about 240, 250, 260, 270. So those are the years. So we started off with 40% fineness in silver in their coins, and I got back down to 5%. Look at the coin. Would you like to have one of those? But that's how they devalued their money. So your money belongs to you as the population. The governments are supposed to look after it on your behalf, but what do? They take charge of it, and they basically steal from you. So I'm going to do videos. I've got a lot of this information on my website in terms of devaluing. And once we get to the point where money starts to get hoarded, or we get defaulting happening in businesses and mortgages, then the amount of money in society gets smaller, and therefore money becomes more valuable. And you'll see that. And the way you see that is that prices are starting to go down, and you're going to start to see that. Housing prices, real estate are going down. It's not the time you want to be buying. You're going to be I would wait 5 years, and you're going to be able, these are some of the incentives that we're getting in cars, for example. They can't give these things away now, or in, let's say 5 years, they won't be able to give them away. So they've come up with all kinds of incentives. That's where you're seeing deflation starting to take hold. Okay, inflation is over. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly because this is a pretty deep subject, and then I'm going to give you a chance to ask some more questions. Homes are going to go down to 80%. Let's put it another way. They're going to go down to about 20% of their value. So they're going to lose about 80% over the next 5 years. In a deflationary environment, because money becomes more valuable, the price of homes goes down. The value of the house doesn't change, but the price of it does, because you don't need as much money. Money is more valuable. So let me put it another way. Once you get a house that is worth $100,000, as we get more inflation and your money becomes worth less, you need more of those dollars. Once you get 4-cent dollars, you need a whole bunch more of them to buy that house. So the house goes up to $1 million in price. And so that's what happens. It's the prices that change. You don't notice it, but it's actually your money that changes value. All right. Gold. One of the things that I'm going to give you information on going forward in these newsletters and videos is where gold is going. In deflation, gold goes down in value. So this was what do we got here? A weekly chart showing gold over a period of 2008 back in here to pretty well where we are today. So this is an older chart, which I'd said the price is going to go up to about here, 1600. This is hard for you to see, I know, 1600 right in here. It's actually about 1700, and it's going to start to come down in 3 waves. And gold is going to be worth $700 at some point, probably in the next 5 years. That is a result of deflation. All right. So gold is not a safe haven. The US dollar, because everybody wants it, or is going to want it once we get everything going under. There's not enough of it around, so people want more of it, and it's going to go up in value. So the US dollar and most currencies will go up in value, but the US dollar is the one that's going to go through the roof. At the same time, gold is going to go down in value. All right, so I'm going to leave that there rather than getting into a whole big long discussion. Debt and banks. Everybody is bankrupt. Here's government debt. They're no longer putting out these figures where I can see them. This is 2014, but you can see all of these countries that are basically bankrupt. Once you get more debt that is more than 60% of your GDP, you can never pay it back. So we've got Japan at the top, and we've got Greece, Italy, Portugal. This was 6 years ago. It's worse now. This is the one I pulled off actually today, world debt. And you can see the most in-debt countries here. They tend to be the G7. And there's a reason for that, but I'm not going to go into it. Here's Luxembourg. This is per capita. Their people owe $7 million each. United States, 77,000, United Kingdom, 127,000 in US dollars. So, this stuff is just not pay. You can't pay it back. So you're going to get an awful lot of government services that are going to go by the wayside. In Canada, for example, Ontario, the province of Ontario, is the most in-debt sub-state in the world. In other words, it's a province. Between provinces and states, it's the most in-debt per capita. It has more debt than California, 4.5 to 5 times the debt of California per capita. It is bankrupt. So if you live in Ontario, you're going to have challenges with government services. I'm going to move ahead here to banks, public and private. We're going to lose, once we get this problem with mortgages, we're going to lose probably in Canada. We have 6 banks in Canada, 6 major ones. We're going to lose probably 3 of them. Banks are Ponzi schemes. And again, I've got information on my website about this as well. Public banks and private banks are 2 different things. Public banks are banks that are backed by taxpayers. We have one in Canada, which happens to be in Alberta, and that's called ATB, and it's backed by taxpayers. There's one in the US, which is the Bank of North Dakota, and that is also backed by taxpayers. Those are the only 2 banks in the North American continent that I know about. And during the recession, those banks were just fine, whereas the other banks were having a big problem. You can fire when you have a public bank that is run by taxpayers or backed up by taxpayers, you can fire the governor or the premier, wherever you happen to live, but you can't fire private bank because that's investors. And if it goes bankrupt, nobody cares. Whereas here, the government cares. And so there is a lot more safety in putting your money in a public bank if you can. Now, I'm not going to get into how these banks work, but they really are Ponzi schemes. And when you put your money in a bank, they tend to leverage it up. And there is a great blog page on my site that explains how banks create money out of nothing. So they take your money and they basically invest it into mortgages or into government mortgages, government loans, those sorts of things. And once mortgages go under, then a lot of that money disappears. And the problem is they don't have anything to back it up. It's fine as long as we don't have a lot of bankruptcies. But once that money disappears and everybody wants it at the same time, it just isn't going to be there. Now, I want you to think about the money that you have in a bank. If you have a lot of it in a bank, I got to ask you why. It's not safe. Once you put your money in a bank, the law says that it belongs to the bank. You're actually investing in that bank's business, and they will promise to pay you back when you want your money if they have it. But that's the law. And if they don't have it, you're up the creek. And so I'm doing a lot of videos coming up on banks and the reality of banks. So what you should do with banks, if you're using it, people say, well, what do you do with transactions? Keep enough money in the bank to do your transactions, but the rest, you should start trying to siphon it out of banks, because once we get a depression, as happened in 1929, banks are going to go under and people are going to want their money all at the same time. So the safest place, as they found out in Europe, and other places, certainly in the US as well in the Great Depression, was buy a big mattress or get yourself a safe. But you want your money in dollar bills, not in digital, because if it's in digital, the banks go under, they just shut off the ATM machine, and you can't get at your money. They shut off your credit cards, you have no money. But if you have it in cash, you always have money. And that's one of the lessons that we have to learn going forward. There's a great book here on debt put together by this lady, Ellen Hodgson. If you really want to learn about the world of debt and banking, this is in plain English. It's an excellent book. It actually talks about the ATB, the bank in Canada, which is the public bank, and it talks about the Bank of North Dakota. So those are a couple of banks that you would get information on. Okay, so I'm going to kind of wrap this up very quickly with some of the things that thriving in the new economy. I'm going to just kind of go through these because I'm getting a little bit late here. I don't want this to go much over an hour and a half. Here's the things that you really need to worry about if we're going into a depression. And these are things that happen at these cycle tops. Where you live, urban versus rural. We know we're going to have famine. People are already talking about it. You won't find this information in the mainstream media because they're too much. They're making money out of getting clicks and talking about whatever the government wants them to talk about, quite frankly. But we're going to get a big move from urban to rural. Why is that? Because you would be well advised to go where there's food. You really need to think where you're going to be. If I was in New York City and we went into a depression and trucking companies are going under and there's no access to food, people get desperate when you get in that kind of environment. And there aren't going to be stores around when you get the market going down to sort of 90% of where it is today. It just isn't going to be there. So you need to either take care of yourself and have access to food ahead of time, and water is the other thing. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So I'll go through these because a lot of these I'm going to be handling in my newsletter in way more depth and in videos going forward. So food and water, farming, gardening, these are the things that you need to start thinking about. Gardening, putting together a garden just in case. Communication, I have a landline here because I'm a little worried about cell phones, and I don't know about the internet, what's going to happen once a lot of these companies go under. Is it still going to be there? Are you going to have the kind of access you have today? Money, gold, silver, cash, self-deposit. So just know where your money is and start thinking about, you know, one of the things that I often say to people, once banks start saying everything is okay, don't worry, and they do it on an unsolicited basis, they just come out and say it, that's the time you should be worried. So I wouldn't be much worried this year, but I would think before this market comes down over the next 8 to 10 months, I would think you want to start to think about where your money is and the banking situation. Banks are trying to move everybody to digital money. Banks don't do this for you. They do it for them. And so this is one of the things that you have to be concerned about. Government services, you're not going to have Social Security. Governments are banks, so you need, bankrupt. So you need to be concerned about where your money is going to come from. You need to be putting some away for the future. Energy. Energy is going to be a problem. It's going to get cheap, but again, trucking it to the various locations could be difficult because there's not enough on. If oil and gas goes down in price to where it is now, because it went down to pretty well zero, nobody's going to be moving that because they don't make money from it. So that's one of the concerns I have in terms of energy, is that you need to be near a source of energy. Community, it's all going to be about the people you know. It's going to be about your family. Make sure that you're surrounded by people that understand what's going on and can provide services. I'll tell you, once we have a depression and the stock market goes down, the first jobs that come back are blue collar. So if you can do something with your hands, that is way more valuable than any white collar job once we get a depression going. So that's something to keep in mind. Personal safety and emergency prep. I'm going to give you a couple of things in that regard. Let me just talk about investments. They're pretty well dead. So here are the things that I would stay away from in red. You want to be out of stocks, unless you're a speculator, unless you're a trader. We've got the stock market's going to go up one more time, and then you want to be out of stocks because it is going to go way, way down starting next year. So that's one of the things. Real estate, all assets go down in price because we go into deflation, and you're starting to see the top in the real estate market. I projected that actually, I thought it was going to happen closer to 2016, but it happened in 2018. The bottom of that 18-and-a-half-year real estate cycle was 2000. So it topped in 2018. Now everybody's crying the blues because they've got all these properties that they can't sell. So these are the things you want to stay away from. If you get into speculating, that can be a good thing if you know what you're doing. That's trading in the stock market, shorting the stock market. If you remember the movie The Big Short, you should go watch that again because we're going to have the bigger short this time around. Precious metals, they're going to go down in value, but that's really real money. And having some around is a good thing, even though it is going to go down in value. The time to buy is probably later on. Money market funds, it really depends on what those are. You really need to think about safety. If they're mutual funds, that's not a good idea because most of the mutual funds will go down. Treasuries is a good place for money. Treasuries, countries, they may go bankrupt. We'll have to see, but it's about the safest place to put your money other than cash, and cash is the safest place to put your money. All right, so I'm going to get to questions here quickly. Let me say something about this pandemic that we've got. This is about the shadiest thing I've ever seen. I've been saying this for months, and a lot of people think that the pandemic cratered the economy. No, the pandemic is an event. It doesn't really have any effect on the economy. I knew that this market was going to go down last year. I got attacked for telling everybody the market was going to go down. And sure enough, it did in February and sort of called the top or around that time, and it came down. It has to do with debt and how the market moves. It has nothing to do with the pandemic. The pandemic actually happened after the market started to come down. And in fact, you've seen the market go up in the last 2 months, 62% pretty well. And that was while all of this pandemic was going on. So the pandemic has little to do with it. The CDC came out today, they're the Center for Disease Control, and said that they basically were wrong about the death rate. And I just checked the death rate in Alberta here 2 days ago, and we actually had 137 people die in Alberta from this coronavirus, and there are 4.7 million people in Alberta. That ends up being 0.2%. The CDC came out and said that the rate of death in the US is 0.2%. Actually, I think they said it's closer to 0.3%. So you have more chance of dying from being in a car accident. And yet we have all of this fear. I just want to let that out there. The other thing that I do is I always, in these days where I expect at the top of these cycles, I expect corruption. I look for things like who's in charge here. And you know that Gates and Fauci says something different about this pandemic every day. Either it's going to kill 7 million people or it's not, and you wear masks or you don't, or the malaria drug is good or it's not. And then you got Gates in the background that owns all of the vaccine companies or invested in all of them, and it smells an awful lot. So the other thing is that I pulled out this chart of Canada and I put it on my website, and it shows you that we've already done 5 waves up. You get 5 waves and trends, not just in the market, but you get it. I've got a great chart somewhere that shows smoking. When we stopped smoking everywhere and you couldn't smoke on planes, it went up in 5 waves and then came down and it was over. I wouldn't expect a second coming of this, because once you get 5 waves, which we've got, it should be over. So I think we're done with this little pandemic. For food, here's one of the things you can be concerned about. I bought four months worth of Mountain House freeze-dried food. And I'm going to give you, if you want to get some of this product, you can still get it. You can get it from the place in Canada is 72hours.ca. And this is the same stuff that you take on camping trips with you. Mountain House is the best. These ones, which are longer term, I got one for 4 months. I got a whole bunch of cans of this. It lasts for 25 years. So you can stick it on a shelf and you don't have to worry about it. It's emergency food. So if we got another pandemic, like, my goodness, Ebola, and you had to stay in your house for 4 months, you'd have food for 4 months. And it tastes great, the Mountain House stuff. I've tried all of them. But you can go to your favorite camping store, your outdoor store, and you can buy a couple of the little packages. All you add is water and see how they taste. You get things like lasagna, and they get lunch and entrees, breakfast, all those types of things in these packages. And that's the way I've gone. That is one way to prepare yourself for the future. I think this is one of the best ways of going, or start a garden. Here's a little thing that is a very good thing to have if you are out in the country and you want to be sure that any water you're drinking is okay. This is called a life straw, and it removes all the bacteria and parasites and microplastics and everything from water. So you can go to your nearest lake, and it doesn't matter what it's like, and drink quite safely out of this straw. And it lasts for a very long time. I don't know. Ultimate survival tool, no shelf life. easy to clean and store, used and tested, $20. So you can Google Life Straw, and there's something that I'll give you that you can look for. This is something that you can have. It's very inexpensive, and will make sure that you have fresh water, because without water, you're dead, baby. That's it. Here's energy. I'm going to share some of these things with you so you can get a generator. And the secret to that is you want to get one that also handles propane. These are in-place generators, and this is one actually you can get from Costco for about $1,000, and it will pretty well power your whole house. So there's things that you can do in that regard. These are alternative medicines. You know, one of the ways to fight this COVID-19, I had it, and I down about 3,000 units of vitamin D a day. It was the mildest flu I've ever had. This is like sunlight in a bottle. And so they've tried to lock everybody in the rooms. This is one of the things that stinks with this COVID-19 thing. They've said everybody stay indoors, and the social distancing, which doesn't work. There's no science in it. But stay indoors is the opposite of what you should do, because during the summertime with sunlight, the flu pandemics or flu just goes away. And that's what you're seeing happening with this COVID virus. And so you have to wonder what is really going on. So it's a case of, I think, following the money. And the last thing I'm just going to tell you here is self-defense. You need to start thinking about that, because when people get hungry now, whatever way you want to do it, I'm not a real big gun advocate, but if you're living in a big city and people are getting hungry around you, they will do anything. And so, you know, when you get into riots and civil wars, you need to start thinking about your safety going forward. So I'll just throw that out there. And then here's a little book. If you want the Prepper's Blueprint, I quite like this book, a step-to-step guide to help you prepare for any disaster. There's an awful lot more books on my website under books, a whole list, and you can learn about cycles and that sort of thing. So that's really my presentation. I wanted to give you enough information that you understood cycles and why this is so important. And this is science, it's observation. These cycles have gone on since the beginning of time. They're periodic. They happen every 172 years, every 1,000 years, every 500 years, like clockwork. That's what you're seeing. And we basically are puppets on a string. I have a video on my website that really talks about that, puppets on a string, because cycles affect everything that happens on Earth. One of the things when I speak, I ask people to think about a straight line. Give me an idea of an actual natural straight line somewhere on Earth. And people think for a while and they come up empty-handed, because it's all waves. It's all waves and spinning globes, and the universe, that's what the universe is made out of. And so when you look at waves, they're sine waves, and that's cycles. And so it goes up and down. We're just in a down stage. We're getting very close to one very soon. So I'm putting together a monthly newsletter and a video, and I'm going to offer these to you. It's going to be $175 US is what I'm thinking for this. I'm not allowing anybody to sign up today. I'm just getting an idea as to whether you would find this valuable. As an early bird, everybody here will be allowed to get this for $90 US. I've got all your emails. I'm going to send out, if there's enough interest in this. If there isn't enough interest, I may not do it. But if there's enough interest, and I'll get it from this group and the next group on Thursday, then I will go ahead and set this up. It will be a website where you will be able to go and ask questions. I don't know whether it's going to be a forum or what that is going to look like, but it will be, because we're all in this together. I don't know everything. I'm going to try and get other people involved in the gardening area so that you'll be able to get tips on that and videos on that sort of thing. This will be a place to go for information and current events, because one of the things that I did was talked about this virus as being a flu. I'm all about the truth. I'm an Aquarian, and if you know anything about Aquarians, truth and freedom are our big things. So this makes me crazy when I see what governments are doing with all this authoritarian stuff and taking away our freedom and our ability to have free speech. So some of the things I'm going to cover is your money, deflation, and inflation, because I can't give you enough information in this in an hour and a half webinar. It's impossible. Some of these subjects are way too deep. I've tried to give you enough information that you have you have information to go forward and understand it. Social mood changes. We've gone into a very negative social mood, and I will be keeping you up on what that means. Politics, important current events. I'm sure Donald Trump is going to get back in the U.S., for example. But if anything was to happen to him, that would be an instant civil war. And so I'm going to get more into that and how he relates to the overall cycles. It's very important that you stay healthy. All right. That is really, really important. I'm going to get into a lot of alternative medicines because the medical system is going to be very stressed if it exists at all at some point. So you need to know how to take care of yourself, and you need to get into some alternative medicines. Gold, bonds, U.S. stock market. I'm going to keep you apprised of the ups and downs in the stock market every month so that you know when we're getting close to a top and when things are going to happen and where gold is going. So that you can load up on gold when it gets low. Predictions based on cycles. I predicted the end of the UN, for example. We know that baseball teams are going to get hit really hard. It's probably the end of the NFL. You know, things like that. I've said that the Olympics is going to get canceled sometime in the near future. I don't know which one it is. But a lot of those things you can see from what is happening. I'm going to talk about food and gardening, and for sure, I'm going to talk about banking. So what I wanted to get from today is just get an idea, and you can say yes within the chat box if any of this is any interest to you, if you would be interested in getting a years-long subscription to videos and newsletters that I send out once a month. And there will be other videos in there. You'll be able to go inside the website because I'm going to do a series of videos on deflation so that you really understand it, and also on banking so that you know how banks operate, because I think that's really, really important. If you're interested at all in participating in this, let me know by just saying yes. And then what I will do is send out to all the people that have been here later on this week. I will send out a sign-up form and some promotional materials. I'm just building another website for it, which is just going to be about this subject so that we have that for us and for people that really want this kind of information. If you're not interested, that's fine. I understand that. And you'll get the information or the request anyway. This is a big subject, I know. I've given you a ton of information. You're going to get a video sent to you after this is over, so you'll be able to go through it. Let me just see if we've got any other questions here that I haven't handled. Damien, do major stock markets use the knowledge of cycles in their trades? No. Some of them do, but we are getting hedge funds going under left and right. Looks like in your charts, the pandemic is not quite in alignment with the climate change. Yes, that's an interesting thing. This pandemic came at the wrong time. It was when the market was at a high. It should be coming when the market is at a low. And that was one of the things that triggered. I said, what's going on here? So I think this has been created in a lab, and I think it has been let out. Now, I'm not going to get into the background of that because I don't actually know. But that's the first thing that triggered my thinking about this pandemic. I said, this is not where it's supposed to be. There is a blog post at the front of my website, worldcyclesinstitute.com, that goes through a lot of this and has got a video attached to it from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who really talks about vaccines. And vaccines, I've had vaccines all my life. They really don't work. Vaccines are just one of those things that don't work well. They try, and some of them have been very damaging. So good ones are okay, but unless they are really researched and tested, and they're talking about getting a vaccine in under a year for this and making it mandatory for everybody, I'm not going there. Let me tell you, they can try, but they're not going to get me. Because of the government intervention with the stock market, we will see the 5 waves, excuse me, or will it be less? You will see the 5 waves. This is a natural phenomenon. It is based on the mood of the herd. We'll call it the trading herd. And I always say that the stock market is a mathematical representation of the mood of the herd. When it's going up, the mood is good. And when it goes down, the mood is turning negative. There are always 5 waves. I mentioned the smoking thing. If you look at, I've looked at a number of the charts on this virus. They almost all have 5 waves. So you can actually, if you kind of look at them on the charts, you'll find that they all sort of have 5 waves. And so that's kind of interesting. It is a natural phenomenon. And sorry, I want to do the opposite. And so that is not going to change. Stock, let me see what I've got here. Yes, interested. Good. We've got a bunch of people interested. Thank you. You're awesome. Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. What about credit unions? Yeah, I don't know enough about credit unions. I think they're better than banks. I just think you have to look at the problem with banks, private banks, is they invest in the stock market. They invest in governments, and governments just go bankrupt. Like they think they're never going to fail. Well, governments do fail. When you get to these 1,000-year cycles, they fail. And they go into, what was I saying? Banks. That was about banks, right? I lost my train of thought. Banks get involved in mortgages and things, and they fail. So that is a problem going forward. So you just have to be aware of what's going on. And as I say, there is time, but if you are sensitive to cycles, you get sensitive to what's happening around you. And so we've got the media that is on this pandemic thing, and nobody's telling the truth in the media. And you know why that is? Because media companies are bankrupt. I used to be in the media. I was in the media for 10 years. And when they're advertising, people aren't buying advertising. They go under. And so they're looking for clicks. And they also are getting money from the government. And if you looked at the US, you can see that a lot of the people in government are married to people in the media. That's something that's quite well known. You can also see that the media has been bought by the elites in the US, certainly. And that goes back to the Rothschild family. And they're the central bankers. And so this is where you get this them and us. There's a 99% and the 1% that would just like to keep everything the way it is. Thank you very much. And all the corruption and making money and inflation. But you know, the thing that they haven't learned about is cycles. And they haven't learned about history, because the thing we have going for us is this market's going to come down and the truth is going to come out, and we're going to have this big reset, and it's going to level the playing field. And I would be worried if I was one of those elites, like the head of Amazon. Not saying anything that way, but they're going to be vilified. And I think a lot of them are going to be targeted, quite frankly, in one way or another. So I want to thank you all for being here. And I hope this has been valuable. I worked a long time on this, and my challenge was trying to get enough content in here that it didn't make you crazy. And I wanted to get across some main themes: that we are at a big turning stage. This is real. It is science. This is what happens. And there's a lot of things pointing to where we're going. It has happened many times in history. And there are certain things you can do about it to prepare yourself. And one of those is not to believe the government. When has the government ever told you anything truthfully? Let me think. John Kennedy, Syria, Libya, Iraq, Iran. Are you getting 9/11? Are you getting the gist of this? So they are not on your side. So this is one of the things. We're going to have a revolution. It's going to happen at some point, I think, in the next 10 years. There is going to be a civil war. And that's just what has happened over and over and over. You just want to be ready for it. So thank you very much. I'm over time. You should get a video of this in the next hour or so. If you don't, email me at peter@worldcyclesinstitute.com, and I will get you a link to the video. If something happens, it all happens automatically, so there shouldn't be a problem with that. But if there is, I want to make sure that you get that, and I will get that to you as soon as I can. So thanks again for being here. Really appreciate it. Stay safe, and let me leave you with this. Life is a game, really. You know, it really is. With all the trials and tribulations I've had, certainly in the medical system, and, you know, Crohn's, I've had lots and lots of surgeries, and I've run a business at the same time. You have to treat it as a game. Going forward, you have to figure out what a goal is for you, because it's all psychology as well. If you have a goal, who are you going to help? What's your place going to be in society? I mean, if you've got a white collar job that is leaving and not coming back, where are you going to put your time? And are you going to go back to university? That's a good thing to do during this time. Or you're going to do some other learning, or you're going to be a valuable member of society going forward. You just want to squirrel away some of the things that are going to keep you financially able to do some of these things, and then you can thrive in the future. If you understand money and you understand deflation, those are some of the key things, and you've got access to water and food and energy, you'll be just fine. And so that's what I wanted to leave you with today. So again, thank you very much, and hope to see you again in another webinar or on my site.